Hi, I'm Dave Brannigan, Fire Chief for the City of Piedmont. I'm with you today to discuss the state of wildfires in California, what we as a city can do to prepare for and mitigate against fires, and what we've learned in recent years about ways communities like ours can become more resilient in the face of growing wildfire threat. Piedmont is at an inflection point. Communities just like ours have burned throughout California. Now's the time to take a hard look at what we're going to do about it. We at the city can't do this in a vacuum. It's time for a community conversation. We're currently in the process of developing a 5-year roadmap for what we can do to reduce the impact of wildfires and other natural hazards. I'll tell you how you can get involved. But let's start with a quick reminder of why we're having this conversation. Last year, we conducted a disaster preparedness survey, and we often engage in community events. One repeated comment we heard in the survey and when talking to Piedmonters is that they generally don't think of Piedmont as being at risk for wildfires. Past and recent history show us otherwise. The Tunnel Fire was a wildfire that started in vegetation near Tunnel Road in Oakland. It quickly spread to structures due to severe Diablo winds. The fire ultimately killed 25 people and injured 150 others. The 1,520 acres destroyed included 2,843 single-family dwellings and over 400 apartment and condominium units. At the time, the Tunnel Fire was the most destructive wildfire in California history. As you can see in the center diagram, the fire spread to Piedmont's doorstep in just under 6 hours, and despite efforts from firefighters throughout California, only spared our city thanks to a shift in winds. This fire forced us to pivot our understanding of wildfire from mostly burning in vegetation to fires that may start in vegetation, but primarily burn structures as winds drive embers miles ahead of flames. You can also see in this picture the flames underneath the car and behind it are driven almost sideways by the severe winds. The Tubbs Fire was a wildfire in Northern California during October 2017. A more recent example of a wildland-urban interface fire that jumped from vegetation to dense neighborhoods. The Tubbs Fire took its place as the most destructive wildfire in California history, burning parts of Napa, Sonoma, and Lake counties, inflicting its greatest losses in the city of Santa Rosa. It burned 36,810 acres and destroyed more than 5,600 structures, half of which were homes in Santa Rosa. On this slide, you can see the mass destruction of a neighborhood that was mostly structures without continuous vegetation. The fire moved so fast due to high winds blowing embers for miles. The center photograph was a Kmart that initially was a safe rendezvous point for incoming firefighters, but it had to be abandoned because when they arrived, they found it engulfed in flames due to the fast spread of ember cast ahead of the winds. Unfortunately, the story progresses. The Palisades Fire, along with the Eaton Fire and other smaller ignitions, is the largest of the recent fires in and around Los Angeles. The latest figures are that it burned over 23,400 acres in Pacific Palisades, Topanga, and Malibu. 6,770 structures are destroyed, with another 904 damaged, and that number may continue to go up. At the time of this recording, the death toll from these fires is at 29. The geographic, weather, and economic profiles of these fires all highlight the similarities and vulnerabilities that Piedmont shares with those communities. The devastation from wildfire is far-reaching, but there is much work happening, and that can happen to make Piedmont more resilient in the face of wildfire. The model we use as professional emergency managers is the disaster management cycle. Seen here, there are 4 phases: mitigation, prevention and preparedness, response, and recovery. Today, we'll talk about all 4, but focus on mitigation. Preparation is about people. Are we ready to respond? Are we ready to seek safety? Are we ready to help our community? In Piedmont, we tackle all of these questions and encourage you to participate to the fullest extent. In fact, we acknowledge that we don't know what we don't know, so we need you. Last year, we conducted the aforementioned disaster preparedness survey and used those responses to help fine-tune and direct programming in the areas that Piedmonters want and need. For example, on the professional level, we have ongoing training in the fire department. We practice for wildfires. We practice with the police department on evacuations. We coordinate training with adjacent agencies to make sure that we're coordinated for big responses. After the evacuation exercises in 2022, we updated our emergency operations plan. This is our guidebook for how we're going to help the community when we are faced with disasters. Regionally, we coordinate the entire county, region, and state for mutual aid and responses. And then finally, here at Piedmont, everything focuses around public education. We want you to understand what you need to do in the face of a disaster. If you're wondering how you can get involved, we're developing right now our next community evacuation exercise. As in 2022, this exercise will focus on an at-risk neighborhood, but also provide activities and preparation for everyone in Piedmont. We're doing this in coordination with the Piedmont Unified School District so that we can include students and parents in the activities we have planned. Before we get to mitigation, let's talk a little bit about how we respond to and recover from wildfires. Severe wildfires rarely come without warning. The National Weather Service issues fire weather watches and warnings for entire regions when weather is looking dry and windy. Commonly known as red flag days, we get that information in advance and Piedmont initiates certain protocols. First, we look at our weather response protocols. When we get notified about fire weather, we confirm it with a spot forecast so we know exactly what's going to be expected in Piedmont. From there, we can do community messaging to give you information about what to expect and what we want you to be prepared to do. We upstaff our fire apparatus. We bring in extra firefighters who patrol the hills and narrow streets looking for hazards and being available to jump on any type of fire activity before it gets out of control. We also have a robust mutual aid system. In California, for the last several years, we have a program that we call pre-positioning, where we, in advance of fire weather, bring in strike teams of fire apparatus. We often put them together in Alameda County and in our neighboring counties. An example of the use of these was this past fall when we had red flag days and Oakland had a fire just off of Highway 580 at Keller Avenue. 2 pre-positioned strike teams came to assist Oakland Fire and Cal Fire to keep that under control before it spread into neighborhoods. PG&E, our local utility, also has a proactive public safety power shutoff program when they hear of these red flag days, and in fact have meteorologists of their own to protect them. They're prepared to shut down power in advance of the weather in order to prevent down power lines from starting wildfires. And while this can be disruptive, they and we get early notice of this and can help message to the community what to expect should that be the case. We also activate our emergency operations plan, the aforementioned guide to how we respond to disasters. We coordinate with our regional partners, and we bring in those extra apparatus specifically for wildfire response. One question I hear a lot, and that you are probably thinking also, is what's FEMA's role in disaster support and recovery? To keep it simple, they're the funding source for a big portion of recovery operations. California Office of Emergency Services offers direct support on the ground and as an extension of FEMA to government entities and individuals impacted by disasters. All of these mechanisms are triggered by disaster proclamations at the local, state, and federal levels. Another big component to recovery is, of course, insurance. It is no surprise that fire insurance coverage is a big topic in California right now. Too big to address entirely in this presentation. However, there are things we can do as a community and as individuals to move towards risk reduction and therefore improve Piedmont's profile for insurance companies. Some of those things are directly tied to mitigation, so let's move into those topics. In Piedmont, mitigation starts on city property. Annually, we clear our part of Moraga Canyon of light and medium vegetation with our fan-favorite herd of goats. This year, we also had private property owners hire their own herd to clear their own property. Way to go, Piedmont. We also, from time to time, bring in significant machinery and staffing to take out larger trees. We actually worked with the Max Wilton community over the last few years to identify larger trees, coordinated with Public Works, arranged for funding, and a lot of that work was done this last year using heavy equipment in those steep ravines. So we're taking care of Piedmont property. When it comes to private property, Piedmont historically is focused on education and advising the public on how to keep vegetation and property fire safe. Inspections are voluntary or complaint-based, and we do our best to come to a satisfactory solution. So that's how we've operated from now and up until now, and there are other options for how to do that, and we can talk about those as a community. Things that we're working on. So this is all coming up here. First of all is fire hazard severity zone maps. CAL FIRE designates very high fire hazard severity zones. They did this in 2007. A small portion of Piedmont is designated as such. And that triggers, that's just hazard, that's not risk. So just because you're in that hazard zone doesn't mean that you're at more or less risk. It just means that there's topography and vegetation that suggests that you could be at a higher exposure to wildfire. So we have some of that in Piedmont. They're putting out new maps. As part of that, we have to adopt those maps through a public process with an ordinance within 120 days. That is going to be combined with 2025 as a fire code update year. And so as the insurance crisis is happening, as fires are springing up all over California, as we're getting new and updated maps about what zones in Piedmont are at different levels of risks, and we have to formally adopt those, and we're looking at fire codes, this is a great opportunity for us as a community to have this conversation about what do we do with that information? Do we continue on the way we're going? Do we get more strict about fire codes and building codes? We'll talk a little bit about mitigation and construction. Or do we keep going the way we're going? And so that's where we're starting with this process, to have that conversation. The North Star in this whole process is our local hazard mitigation plan. This is a FEMA-required plan that outlines Piedmont's strategies for reducing risk from natural hazards over the next 5 years. We're currently updating our mitigation plan. This process began last fall. We've studied the hazards that pose the most risk to Piedmont, and now it's time to start looking at what strategies we will use to mitigate them. We're partnering with lots of agencies: Oakland, Piedmont Unified School District, East Bay Mud, Red Cross, all city staff, and community members who are subject matter experts are involved as well. And now we need your help too. We are at this starting point of opportunity to have this conversation as a city. What you see on this slide is significant. This is a demonstration of a structure on the right that meets something called wildfire prepared standards, and the structure on the left is typical construction that involves, it was built to code, but not to the advanced code that you would need to be really wildfire prepared. And you can see the difference in the ignition and the burning of that. So where do we want to go? There's a program, and this stems a little bit from the insurance crisis. There's a program being promoted through the insurance commissioner's office called Safer for Wildfires. And it outlines a lot of things that you can do personally when you have property to make your property safer from wildfire. These are 9 specific things that everybody should be considering doing. A couple things I want to point out: that these are not mandatory. This is what's being talked about as a way to improve your resilience against wildfire on your property. Things like a Class A fire-rated roof, not hard to come by if you're replacing your roof. A 5-foot ember-resistant zone. This is something that we need to talk about as a community. That's 5 feet of nothing that can burn next to your house. This is a standard that is quickly being talked about as potential code across California. So that would significantly change the landscape and the look of Piedmont. There's ways to do it beautifully. There's ways to do it safely. It's just different. So that's one thing that jumps out at people as, oh, a 5-foot non-combustible zone. That's intense, and it could be. But the result of not having that is what we've talked about in the history of the fires in California. And then there's the community level actions that can be taken. So Firewise Communities are a standard created by the National Fire Protection Agency. A Firewise community is a neighbor-driven organization with the primary purpose of initiating contact with your neighbors, doing your own community risk assessment, and a 3-year action plan. And if you do those things, you can actually apply and become a certified Firewise community. We're here to assist with that. It's not driven by staff or by city governments. It's specifically designed to engage community members, sort of like Neighborhood Watch, but for wildfire safety. And then at the whole community level, there is also a classification that California now created called a fire risk reduction community. Some of the conditions are listed here. You have to have a very high fire hazard severity zone, so we would qualify from that. If Piedmont chose to move this way, it would require fire code adoption and wildland vegetation management adoption that is above and beyond minimum codes. So, and enforcement of those things. So the benefit would be that this helps us be a more resilient community from a risk perspective. It helps residents who may have problems getting or keeping insurance, but it is a big ask of the community. So this is a where could we go? This is something we're going to be talking about over the next year, and we'll want your feedback and input on that. Also, fire weather policies. I mentioned we have protocols, but we could go further. Us activating extra personnel and doing patrols is one thing. Do we want to restrict parking on narrow streets on red flag days? Do we want to restrict barbecuing and outdoor fires on red flag days? Do we want to restrict construction that uses heat generating tools such as roofing, even weed whackers and lawnmowers on red flag days? We don't currently enforce that. We don't currently require that those things are stopped. Our messaging usually says, please don't do these things. But as a community, we want to consider, do we do these things? Another thing that is preemptive relocation. For people who have difficulty with mobility or just the means to do so, the fewer people we have in the area, if a wildfire starts, the better for you and the better for responders. So some jurisdictions encourage people to leave the area on red flag days if they think it might be difficult for them to otherwise leave the area once a disaster starts. Again, nothing that we're saying is going to happen, but it's conversations that we want to have. Now that you've learned what Piedmont does today to be ready for wildfire and seen some options for what we could do in the future, it's time for your call to action. The work we're doing now and over the next several months, developing the local hazard mitigation plan, adopting new fire hazard severity maps, and updating our building code will shape the way we address wildfire risk as a community in the coming years. Get engaged. This is a whole community process. Tell us what you want to see happen. There are 2 key opportunities to participate coming up that I want you to know about. First, we're asking for input now on policies, projects, or programs that you'd like to see included in our 5-year mitigation strategy. Scan the QR code on the screen or visit piedmont.ca.gov/LHMP to share your suggestions. Second, mark your calendar for Wednesday, March 26th. We'll be hosting a public workshop about the mitigation strategy where community members can share feedback on and help prioritize possible mitigation actions. I hope to see you there. Stay informed about these and other opportunities to engage in this process by signing up for email updates. Scan that QR code on your screen, or again, visit piedmont.ca.gov/LHMP to subscribe.